Today is October 14th, 2023. I'm going to be going over the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and the escalating conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. But before I get into that, I want to go over the bigger picture here, geopolitically, what the United States is doing and how these two conflicts and many others are all connected. So let's start by just taking a look at countries with United States military bases and facilities. Obviously the United States, but you can see Europe has a significant US military presence there, the Middle East, and Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. In Europe, we see this proxy war against Russia unfolding in Ukraine. The US has invested millions of dollars, billions of dollars in decades trying to shape all of Europe into a united front against Russia. The primary foothold of US primacy in the Middle East is in Israel, although they do have bases in Saudi Arabia and other Persian Gulf nations. They're illegally occupying both Iraq and Syria. They even have a military base in Turkey. And again, the US has invested billions of dollars, decades, and has even fought wars all across the Middle East in an attempt to unite it against Iran. Iran is a very close ally of Russia and China, and controlling Iran further encircles and contains both Russia and China. And then in Asia, the US has tens of thousands of troops in South Korea and Japan, increasingly in the Philippines. They use Taiwan, which you can barely see on this map. They're using Taiwan as a focal point against the rest of China. And in the same way, they use Israel in the Middle East and Ukraine in Eastern Europe. And if you look at all of this together, it's an arc of occupation, war, and proxy war aimed at controlling all of Eurasia. So if you understand that, then you understand the common denominator among all of these conflicts or potential conflicts, and you can begin to see through the minutia of each one of these conflicts. The United States and all empires before it go into a region and they identify the causes that are most important to the people there so that they could use that to divide and conquer. That's what the empire's always done. That is what the United States does right now. And I want to just continue with this point. The National Endowment for Democracy goes into countries and interferes politically. They build up opposition groups. They undermine ruling governments. And on their own website, they have a web page called Where NED Works, and it's across the entire planet. The United States doesn't divide its military commands in relation to different parts of the United States that they defend. It is divided across the entire planet, as you can see with this map. So this is a modern day global empire, and they are using divide and conquer in different regions of the globe, and particularly around Eurasia, to encircle and contain their peer and near peer adversaries, Russia and China. So that's what I want to go over before we dive into the actual situation in Ukraine and now in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians, and possibly drawing in other nations. Let's go over first what is taking place in Ukraine. So the US is waging proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, but it is going very poorly. The Ukrainian offensive, which was launched primarily in the south, but also in the east toward Bakhmut, it has, for all intents and purposes, collapsed. And if we zoom in on where Ukraine made these meager gains, we had heard earlier this month and last month, breakthroughs, we can see that even this pro-Ukrainian liveuamap.com is indicating that Russian forces are on the offensive around Robotyno, and they had been around Verobove, and it's safe to say that Ukrainian forces have not made any more progress. That was not a breakthrough, and the offensive seems to have petered out there. If we go even before we reach Bakhmut and the situation there, there is a situation developing around Avdiivka. And around Avdiivka, you see all these red rifle icons. These are Russian forces pushing out beyond the Russian-held territory. And as you can see, there is an encirclement forming around Avdiivka. And of course, all of the progress we heard Ukraine was making around Bakhmut, that has subsided, and Russian forces have been pushing hard around Kupiansk. And I don't think in any of these areas Russia is trying to storm and take over these cities. It really seems like they're trying to cut off and isolate the Ukrainian forces there before they do that, which is somewhat similar to how Russia, through the Wagner organization, took Bakhmut. Now, Ukrainian sources are claiming, especially regarding this Avdiivka operation, that Russia is suffering major losses. I'm not seeing any convincing evidence of this. Of course, they will suffer losses. They're on the offensive. But it's important to remember that Russia has the ability to take more losses than Ukraine. They have more soldiers, they have more equipment. Russia's military industrial capacity has the ability to replace losses at a far higher rate than the collective West. And now we're hearing less and less about NATO transferring military weapons to Ukraine. This has been an ongoing trend, diminishing Western military support for Ukraine. And it's not a matter of political will, it's a matter of practicality. The stockpiles are empty, and the West's military industrial capacity cannot replace these stockpiles fast enough. But let's take a look at some of the packages that have been sent recently. We have this from Defense One: Germany to send Ukraine $1 billion in air defense tech plus more tanks. And when they say more tanks, they're talking about the Leopard 1, the predecessor of the Leopard 2 tank, which was used and failed to make any difference during the recent Ukrainian offensive. The Leopard 1 is an even older tank, developed in the 1950s, lighter armor, smaller gun, insufficient for what is required on the battlefield in Ukraine. Now, this article says Germany will send about 1 billion euros, 1.1 billion US dollars worth of air defense systems to Ukraine as part of a second winter package for the embattled country, the German Defense Ministry said. The support will include Patriot air defense system and 2 IRST surface-to-air systems, as well as 10 more Leopard 1 main battle tanks, 3 Gepard anti-aircraft guns, armored trucks and ambulances, in addition to more than 20 million in kit, specifically for Ukraine's special forces. Now, these air defense deliveries are only going to replace Ukrainian losses. It is not going to expand Ukraine's air defense capabilities. They're talking about 10 Leopard 1 tanks. 10 of any kind of tank would be insufficient. 10 antiquated, lightly armored, lightly armed tanks, together with 3 Gepard anti-aircraft guns, these mobile anti-aircraft tracked vehicles. This is all symbolic. This is not real military support for Ukraine. This is purely symbolic, and it will make absolutely no difference at all on the battlefield. Also recently, the United States announced another security assistance package to Ukraine. This is via the U.S. Department of Defense. Biden administration announces additional security assistance for Ukraine October 11th, 2023. I'm going to go over the items in this package. Again, very meager package. AIM 9M missiles for air defense. This is most likely for the NASAM air defense systems. Notice there's no mention of Patriot missiles, additional Patriot missiles. Germany is sending a system, and hopefully for Ukraine, missiles, but I haven't heard of the U.S. transferring any additional Patriot missiles to Ukraine. And again, there was a shortage even before the U.S. sent Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine. There was a shortage that developed during Saudi Arabia's war with Yemen. And the U.S. has not been able to expand its manufacturing of these missiles to meet demand, and they won't be able to for years, and that's if they decide to expand production to meet this demand. Counter unmanned aerial systems, there's no details or quantities mentioned. Additional ammunition for high mobility artillery rocket system, that's HIMARS. Again, no quantities mentioned. And as I pointed out, there was a CNN article that talked about the daily rate of fire of these HIMARS systems that Ukraine is operating, about 18 rockets per day. 18 rockets per day. A very small amount, and anything more than that would most likely outpace the United States' ability to manufacture and send those rockets. That would end up in short supply. 155 millimeter and 105 millimeter artillery rounds. Again, no quantities mentioned. No quantities have been given for months. In the beginning, they had been giving quantities. They were very large numbers, so they wanted to show the public how many artillery rounds they were sending. They're not mentioning this number anymore, almost certainly because it's a very meager amount. It would indicate to the public that the West is out of ammunition to send to Ukraine. And I'm going to get into this in a moment, but the very few artillery shells the US is producing and sending to Ukraine, now it's going to almost certainly be diverted between Ukraine and Israel. So even fewer to spare now. It says precision aerial munitions, but for what aircraft? What military aviation does Ukraine still have that these precision aerial munitions are going to be used by and make any difference on the battlefield? Electronic warfare. Again, no details given, no quantities given. I've not heard of many success stories regarding electronic warfare in the hands of Ukrainians, whether it's Soviet-era equipment that they're using or Western equipment transferred over to them. Tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided missiles, TOW missiles, anti-tank guided missiles. These are older, more cumbersome than the Javelin if you're using it as an infantry weapon. It is also used on vehicles, and particularly the Bradley infantry fighting vehicles the U.S. transferred to Ukraine, so that might be where these are going. AT-4 anti-armor systems. These are an older, less sophisticated anti-tank man-portable rocket, less sophisticated, older than, again, the Javelin. Small arms and more than 16 million rounds of small arms ammunition. Now, again, 16 million rounds. They include that number because it sounds big and they know ordinary people have no idea what the rate of fire is in the middle of a firefight. And that's, if you divided that just by 4,000, the size of a full-strength brigade, and then you try to figure out how many bullets they would each member of the brigade would have over the course of a month, it's very little. You could see how little that actually is. Demolitions, munitions for obstacle clearing. Again, this would have been something useful ahead of the offensive, not as it's culminated and collapsing. Spare parts, training munitions, maintenance, and other field equipment. Again, no specific details or quantity. And altogether, this was, again, another meager assistance package. Now, as this situation continues to deteriorate in Ukraine, there was already an arms shortage. Now the United States is dividing what it has on hand between Ukraine and Israel. We have a Time magazine article here. Biden and Congress craft $2 billion aid package as Israel vows to crush Hamas. This was October 11th. It says the funding would go toward replenishing Israel's stockpile of interceptors for its Iron Dome missile defense system, artillery shells, and other munitions. And as I pointed out in a previous video, the United States actually removed 300,000 155 millimeter artillery shells from stockpiles in Israel for both the US and Israel's use. They took that and they transferred it to Ukraine. Now they're going to be taking 155 millimeter shells and sending them back to Israel. And we could continue to hear the US claim that they can support both Ukraine and Israel at the same time. Don't forget the proxy war the US is setting the stage for between Taiwan and the rest of China. They cannot They cannot sustain any one of these, let alone all three. Now, it should be pointed out that each one of these proxy wars require different types of weapon systems and munitions. There is crossover. So, for example, Ukraine primarily needs artillery and armor, but they also need air defense systems. Israel needs artillery. They also have M270 multiple launch rocket systems, which use the same guided rockets as HIMARS. But they're, I think, primarily going to need large amounts of precision guided aerial munitions. Bombs, essentially, guided bombs, which is something that Ukraine is getting, but in very small quantities. So the US could most certainly support Israel in this aspect. But then again, Israel also needs air defense systems. They have the Iron Dome. There's an interesting article from Bloomberg. US gives first Iron Dome interceptors to Israel. US to send more Tamir interceptors to Israel. Interceptors are located in Israel, but owned by the US. A somewhat strange arrangement. The Pentagon has transferred to Israel the first missiles in US inventories for the Iron Dome air defense system to intercept Hamas rockets, according to a US defense official. The initial Tamir interceptors, owned by the US but located in Israel, will be followed by more from American inventories elsewhere to ensure that Israel has the capability to sustain its air defense systems. The official declined to say why the U.S. had stocks of the interceptor in Israel or where the additional ones are currently located. The missiles are manufactured by Rafael Advanced Defense Systems in Israel, with RTX Corporation components made in Arizona. And the Iron Dome received huge amounts of U.S. funding for its development, even though it's manufactured in Israel. So that's a very odd arrangement, but Israel's also using the Patriot air defense system. So any additional Patriot missiles are going to have to be divided between Ukraine and Israel. And of course, the proxy war the US is attempting to trigger between Taiwan and the rest of China, which might include direct intervention by the US itself. This is primarily going to depend on long-range standoff weapons like cruise missiles. So weapons, munitions that the US isn't currently sending to either Ukraine or Israel. But Taiwan is almost certainly going to need air defense systems. So a big problem the US has created for itself. Striving for global hegemony, attempting to encircle, contain, and control Eurasia, but not having a military-industrial base capable of sustaining the conflicts that will erupt from this pursuit. Now let's get into detail about Israeli military operations. So let me just recap what has happened most recently. On October 7th, this was Hamas carrying out these raids into Israeli-held territory. They attacked military targets, bases, vehicles, troops. We saw all of that in the videos, but they also attacked civilians and non-combatants, even foreign laborers, including several Thai workers. I want to show you this article from the BBC. Hamas attacked, 12 Thais killed and 11 kidnapped in Israel. And I'm based in Thailand, and there are videos emerging of these killings, and there are Thai survivors who are coming back to Thailand and telling people what happened. And Hamas was basically using ISIS-style brutality to kill these Thai laborers who had no involvement politically. They were people who went to an agency that sent them overseas, sometimes to maybe United Arab Emirates, sometimes to Israel, sometimes to some other country. They have nothing to do with the political situation, and yet they were targeted and brutally murdered. This is terrorism. This is terrorism. This is unacceptable. Wholly unnecessary, and I would say almost deliberately provocative. Many Thai people that I talk to who are politically aware are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, but this outraged them, and this has put them at odds with Hamas. Now, the impact of these Hamas raids were putting certain parts of the Israeli military off balance. And they have since reestablished full control. And now they've established a perimeter around Gaza, which is this very small enclave along the coast with the Mediterranean Sea, densely populated, urban environment. Israel has already, to a very high degree, controlled what can and cannot go into and out of Gaza. And now Israel is tightening that control. So we have, first of all, this article from the BBC. Israel's military says it fully controls communities on Gaza border. Israel's military says troops are in full control of all the communities along the border with Gaza 2 days after Hamas's unprecedented assault. Fighting between troops and Palestinian militants in several areas on Monday morning had become isolated, a spokesman told reporters, but he warned that militants might still be at large. And this article is from 2 or 3 days ago. It also said Israel's defense minister, meanwhile, ordered a complete siege of Gaza. So Hamas carried out their raids. They attacked military targets. They also committed war crimes. Now Israel is retaliating, and now they are openly announcing their intention to carry out war crimes and crimes against humanity. So we have this article from Business Insider. For people in Gaza, life is about to get even worse, with Israel's siege about to starve the population, NGO says, but also the Israeli government says. The article says, following Israel's announcement of a complete siege of Gaza, fears are mounting over an impending humanitarian crisis in the territory. Hamas's surprise attack on Saturday, October 7th, which Israel said has led to the death of at least 1,200 Israelis, prompted Israel to declare war on the group and increase airstrikes on Gaza. And I'll get into those airstrikes here in just a moment. Palestinian authorities say at least 950 Palestinians have been killed so far. Even before Hamas's attack, Israel controlled most of the occupied Palestinian territories' food, water, and power. The UN Special Rapporteur described the city as an open-air prison, so a representative from the UN. And conditions in the territory now look set to get even worse. Israel's defense minister reportedly said on Monday that Gaza will get no electricity, no food, no fuel. So it's not an NGO saying this. It is the Israeli government saying this, adding that everything is closed. Israel has since stopped food, fuel, and medicines from entering the territory. Medicines. This was reported by the Associated Press. The article also points out that without power, hospitals will struggle to treat patients, obviously. Again, deliberately targeting the civilian population. A military organization like Hamas will have made provisions to provide itself with food, water, energy, shelter, medicine, absolutely everything it needs. It'll only be the civilian population that suffers, and Israel knows this, and they are deliberately doing that. And regarding the bombing, we have this, again, declared by the Israeli government and military. This is from The Guardian. Emphasis is on damage, not accuracy. Ground offensive into Gaza seems imminent. This was October 10th, 2023. IDF, that stands for Israeli Defense Force spokesperson, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, made the startling admission that hundreds of tons of bombs had already been dropped on the tiny strip, adding that emphasis is on damage and not on accuracy. The question now is whether the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will continue with his promise to flatten the enclave, home to 2.3 million trapped civilians, or reoccupy it. And flatten is in quotation marks. It also says Israel pulled out occupying ground forces from Gaza in 2005. The strip was taken over by Hamas, and I'll talk more about Hamas in this video in just a moment. The strip was taken over by Hamas during the Palestinian Civil War, with the secular Fatah Party 2 years after that, leading Israel and Egypt to besiege it. And there have now been 5 wars and several smaller escalations between Israel and Gaza's fighting factions since then. And so this brings me back to Hamas, and I get a lot of questions about Hamas, and I observe a lot of misunderstanding about Hamas, where it came from, and what it's really doing versus what people imagine it's doing. Israel is clearly in violation of international law. There are UN resolutions recognizing Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territory and the need for it to leave those territories, and for a settlement of this conflict resulting in a two-state solution, a Palestinian state and an Israeli state. Israel refuses to recognize any of this. People in Palestine have a right to fight for this territory that is being illegally occupied under international law. And they also have a right to fight against Israeli aggression, which is constant. We just watched the Israeli government announce its intention to carry out multiple extensive war crimes, cutting off food, water, deliberately denying the civilian population medicine, and then indiscriminately bombing this densely populated urban environment. Those are deliberate war crimes, and they announced their intention to do all of this. And they enjoy complete impunity from the West, Western governments, most of the Western media. And this is very similar to the impunity Ukraine enjoys. Ukraine, from 2014 onward, had been shelling the population, the civilian population of the Donbas region. They were passing laws to restrict the Russian language among Russian-speaking Ukrainians. All of these things that, had it been a US adversary doing, would be characterized as either actual genocide or cultural genocide, or both. So there's no dispute at all whatsoever over whether or not Palestinians are justified in armed resistance. They absolutely are. The problem is that is not what Hamas is doing. Hamas is a creation alongside Israel of Western hegemony in the region. It's sprung from the Muslim Brotherhood, which has also been used for decades by the US to control the Middle East, the wider Arab world, even Egypt in North Africa. And Hamas was created specifically to get rid of any sort of strategically thinking, diplomatically oriented, rational resistance group for the Palestinian people. In other words, a Palestinian version of, say, Hezbollah, which a lot of people lump together with Hamas, but is a completely different organization with a completely different approach and completely different associations, diplomatic ties, and support in the region. And we hear the Western media declaring Hamas a terrorist organization, but at the same time, in the past, the Western media has admitted who is actually behind the rise of Hamas and why. So we have this article first from 2009, Wall Street Journal, how Israel helped to spawn Hamas. Hamas, to my great regret, is Israel's creation, says Mr. Cohen, a Tunisian-born Jew who worked in Gaza for more than 2 decades, responsible for religious affairs in the region until 1994. Mr. Cohen watched the Islamist movement take shape, muscle aside secular Palestinian rivals, and then morph into what is today Hamas, a militant group that is sworn to Israel's destruction. Instead of trying to curb Gaza's Islamists, from the outset, says Mr. Cohen, Israel for years tolerated and in some cases encouraged them as a counterweight to the secular nationalists of the Palestinian Liberation Organization and its dominant faction, Yasser Arafat's Fatah. Think about Hamas leaning more toward extremism versus a secular armed resistance in say Gaza or the West Bank, for the Palestinian people. How much easier it would be for the rest of the region to pour support behind the Palestinian people. Think about it, especially now, the way the world is shifting away from US-led unipolarism toward multipolarism. There's a reason that Egypt strictly controls what passes in and out over their border with Gaza, because Hamas, an outcrop of the Muslim Brotherhood being an opposition group, that had overthrown the Egyptian government in the past and remains to this day a persistent threat to Egypt's political stability and national security. The U.S. during the Arab Spring, and I'll get into this more in just a moment, the U.S. during the Arab Spring backed the Muslim Brotherhood in overthrowing the Egyptian government in 2011. The article also points out Israel's experience echoes that of the US, which during the Cold War looked to Islamists as a useful ally against communism. Anti-Soviet forces backed by America after Moscow's 1979 invasion of Afghanistan later mutated into Al-Qaeda. But of course, that later mutation into Al-Qaeda served as the perfect pretext for the United States to invade nations all across the region, around the world even. And when they weren't using Al-Qaeda as a pretext to invade and occupy a nation, they used it as a proxy against nations they couldn't outright invade, or at least initially, including Libya and also Syria. And I want to point out how long this has been going on, and how, especially in regards to the Arab Spring in 2011, how the US prepared years in advance to achieve this. So we have this article from the New Yorker by Seymour Hersh titled "The Redirection. Is the administration's new policy benefiting our enemies in the war on terrorism?" The article says, to undermine Iran, which is predominantly Shia, the Bush administration has decided, again, this is 2007, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shia organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant version of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, but only superficially. The rank and file are hostile towards America. Their leadership and the organization itself is receiving U.S. support laundered through America's Persian Gulf allies, at least at the time. The article also talks about the Muslim Brotherhood specifically, from which Hamas emerged. If the United States does try to move against Syria, members of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood would be the ones to talk to. This is a source that Seymour Hersh was citing. The Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, a branch of radical Sunni movement founded in Egypt in 1928, engaged in more than a decade of violent opposition to the regime of Hafez Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father. In 1982, the Brotherhood took control of the city of Hama. Assad bombarded the city for a week, killing between 6,000 and 20,000 people. Membership in the Brotherhood is punishable by death in Syria. The Brotherhood is also an avowed enemy of the US and Israel, but again, only superficially, because in reality, the Brotherhood helps advance US foreign policy objectives, which includes its support of Israel. All the way back in 2007 was setting the stage for the 2011 Arab Spring. There's another article, and I've gone over this many, many times, from the New York Times, 2011, U.S. groups help nurture Arab uprising. And this article, I'm going to go over it again, just so people are clear about what happened. The U.S., according to Seymour Hersh, all the way back in 2007, was preparing networks of armed militants. This New York Times article indicates the actual protesters, they were also organized years in advance by the United States. So it says a number of groups and individuals directly involved in the revolts and reforms sweeping the region, including the April 6th youth movement in Egypt, the Bahrain Center for Human Rights, and grassroots activists like Ethar Qadi, a youth leader in Yemen, received training and financing from groups like the International Republican Institute, the National Democratic Institute, and Freedom House, a nonprofit human rights organization based in Washington, according to interviews in recent weeks and American diplomatic cables obtained by WikiLeaks. And remember, if Julian Assange and WikiLeaks never revealed this to the world, we may never have actually gotten this New York Times article. The Republican and Democrat institutes are loosely affiliated with the Republican and Democrat parties. They were created by Congress and are financed through the National Endowment for Democracy, which has set up which was set up in 1983 to channel grants for promoting democracy in developing nations. The National Endowment receives about $100 million annually from Congress. Freedom House also gets the bulk of its money from the American government, mainly from the State Department. So I just showed you the map in the beginning of where the NED operates all around the globe, and what they do is political subversion. The article also says some Egyptian youth leaders attended a 2008 technology meeting in New York where they were taught to use social networking and mobile technologies to promote democracy. Among those sponsoring the meeting were Facebook, Google, MTV, Columbia Law School, and of course the State Department, the US State Department, which actually organized it. So Seymour Hersh was warning people that the US was building a network of armed militants as far back as 2007. As far back as 2008, the US State Department was preparing all of these activists to create the protests that would serve as cover for these armed groups to begin overthrowing or just destroying these countries, or both. This is where Hamas came from, this same network of support, the same network of interference, the same network of manipulating and interfering in the internal political affairs of nations around the globe. And the Palestinian people are no exception. The U.S. is just as interested as getting in there, getting involved, and meddling. And again, I want to remind people of this. The Arab Spring, engineered years in advance by the U.S., both the militant networks and the political activists. That unfolded in 2011, and then the U.S. proxy wars began, and we had this article from Reuters. This is about Hamas specifically. So we heard about how the Muslim Brotherhood was involved. We saw them overthrow the government in Egypt, and Hamas, out of the Muslim Brotherhood, ditches Assad, backs Syrian revolt. This was 2012, and I've gone over this article many times in previous videos. And remember, in 2011, when the Arab Spring began, the United States and Europe, even Israel, they all pretended they were shocked and surprised by this. Their intelligence networks claimed they didn't see this coming. Of course, they were organizing it years in advance. So they deliberately pretended that it was a surprise and an intelligence failure. Keep that in mind when we hear about Israeli intelligence failures amid this most recent Hamas raid. Why did the US and Israel maneuver Hamas into power? Why did they do this? They did this because they wanted an opposition led by extremists that would divide Palestinian people. It would complicate the Palestinians people, their diplomatic relations with nations in the region and around the globe. Again, why is Egypt hesitant to support the Palestinian people? Because they would be giving money and resources to a government and an administration headed by a Muslim Brotherhood faction. The Muslim Brotherhood, which was used by the US to disrupt and destabilize Egypt from 2011 onward. By creating an extremist movement among the Palestinian people, Israel is able to justify in the minds of its population and many people around the world its militarization at home and its brutality against the Palestinian people. It allows Israel to continue this process of grinding down both the West Bank and Gaza, eliminating the Palestinian people, which is what they're talking about with this ground operation, eliminating them so that there is no chance for a two-state solution. And it's not speculation. This is from Haaretz. This is an Israeli newspaper. Yes, it's an op-ed, but the part I'm going to read to you is documented fact. The title is, "Why Did Netanyahu Want to Strengthen Hamas?" The article says, between 2012 and 2018, Netanyahu gave Qatar approval to transfer a cumulative sum of about $1 billion to Gaza, at least half of which reached Hamas, including its military wing. According to the Jerusalem Post, another Israeli newspaper, in a private meeting with members of his Likud party on March 11, 2019, Netanyahu explained the reckless step as follows: the money transfer is part of a strategy to divide the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. Anyone who opposes the establishment of a Palestinian state, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, despite its mandate by the UN, needs to support the transfer of the money from Qatar to Hamas. In that way, we will foil the establishment of a Palestinian state, as reported in former cabinet member Haim Rahman's Hebrew language book, Neged Haruch, and if I'm pronouncing this wrong, my apologies. In an interview with the Ynet news website on May 5th, 2019, Netanyahu associate Gerson Hakohen, a major general in reserve, said, "We need to tell the truth. Netanyahu's strategy is to prevent the option of two states, so he is turning Hamas into his closest partner. Openly, Hamas is an enemy. Covertly, it's an ally." And isn't that what I was just talking about in terms of Al-Qaeda, also ISIS, the Muslim Brotherhood, and of course, now we have this admission about Hamas itself. And isn't that exactly the role Hamas's most recent raid served? Do you see that these raids moved us one step closer to a two-state solution, or a step closer to the complete eradication, as envisioned by the current Israeli government, of the Palestinian people, both in the West Bank and in Gaza? I think the answer to that is pretty obvious. It's also important to remember that many other nations have diplomatic relations with Hamas. They talk with Hamas. They have to work with Hamas to get support to the Palestinian people. That includes many nations around the world who oppose Hamas, don't agree with Hamas, don't approve or condone of their actions, and have even condemned this most recent raid. And the reason they do that is because they, despite their differences with Hamas, they support the Palestinian people themselves, and they need to assist the Palestinian people. They need to work through Hamas in order to do that. Hamas controls Gaza. They also attempt to deal with Hamas in an attempt to influence it to pivot away from its worst impulses and to become more like a resistance group such as Hezbollah, which is very successful in actually defending the Lebanese people rather than prolonging or perpetuating Israeli brutality against them. So right now, who primarily influences and shapes Hamas's decision-making? Do we actually know? We keep hearing about Iran. Iran is consistently connected to Hamas in this most recent raid. We have articles like this from the Washington Post. U.S. Qatar agreed to stop Iran from tapping $6 billion fund after Hamas attack. It says U.S. officials and the Qatari government have agreed to stop Iran from accessing a $6 billion account for humanitarian assistance in light of Hamas's attack on Israel. It also says further punitive measures against Iran are possible. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen suggested Wednesday that the U.S. is considering additional sanctions on Iran. Now listen to this part. While there has been no evidence of Iran's direct role in the slaughter, U.S. officials say Hamas has received weapons and training from Iran, the Washington Post previously reported. But then again, they never talk about any of this evidence, and this is just a claim that they repeat over and over again until people accept it as fact. Nowhere in the article is Qatar's role in supporting Hamas, and it has a much larger role in supporting Hamas. And how do we know that? Because the U.S. Senate, during their hearings, that is what they determined. So we have this. This is actually from 2014. Hamas's benefactors, a network of terror. And Qatar is mentioned 137 times. Iran is only mentioned 78 times. And what did they actually say about both Qatar and Iran? And also Turkey, by the way. It says, again, you have to remember the witnesses who testified, these were all drawn from these US governments and arms industry funded think tanks. So please keep that in mind. But here are some of the things that they said about Qatar's sponsorship of Hamas. Qatar has been known to be perhaps the largest financial patron of Hamas. So they're saying Qatar even above and beyond Iran. It says, the U.S. administration took a step to block a recent transfer of funds from Qatar to Hamas terrorists. And earlier this year, the Treasury Department openly admitted that Qatar, for many years, has openly financed Hamas. It's also supporting extremist groups operating in Syria, the same ones the US was arming and backing, by the way, and has become such a permissive terrorist financing environment for all of these groups, and that includes its funding of the Muslim Brotherhood, and along with Kuwait has become a major source of funding for ISIS, a threat that must be eliminated. And by the way, the US maintains a military base in Qatar. It is considered a US ally. And even though they mention Iran many times during this hearing, this is what they ultimately say. They say, so who are Hamas's benefactors? We have heard them from the other opening statements. So this is one witness referencing these others talking about Qatar, Iran, Turkey. They are Qatar and Turkey and Iran. Iran has played a major role. There was a falling out in 2001 over Hamas siding with the anti-Assad forces in Syria. That has been patched up to some degree. No, it is not. But Iran is so preoccupied with other events involving Shia from Lebanon to Iraq that it has reduced its support for Hamas for both political and economic reasons. So even these US government and arms industry funded think tank analysts or experts who want to link Iran to Hamas, they're even admitting that there really isn't a link. It's basically Qatar, a US ally hosting US troops at an airbase in Qatar, and Turkey, a NATO member, which also hosts US forces on their territory. The US could stop this at any time, but they're not. And we already know how Israel encouraged Qatar to send this money to Hamas, and there's no way the US was unaware of this and uninvolved. Targeting Iran isn't about punishing a nation they think is supporting Hamas. They're targeting Iran because this is about who can and cannot be allowed to associate with Hamas and influence Hamas. If Iran begins influencing Hamas, it will pivot away from its extremist approach, and it will look and act more like Hezbollah, and it will attract more attention and support from the Arab world than Hamas currently does. And this will complicate and impede this process of eliminating the Palestinian people, eliminating the possibility for a two-state solution, and it'll further isolate the US and its Israeli proxies. So this is why they're singling out Iran, targeting Iran, shifting the blame on Iran when they know Turkey and Qatar are actually the ones sponsoring Hamas, and I would say most likely laundering a large amount of US support through their networks, reaching Hamas. Just like ISIS, just like Al-Qaeda. And again, it's important to keep in mind, Hamas prevented the rise of a practical resistance movement in say, Gaza or the West Bank, a movement similar to Hezbollah in Lebanon. They have participated with the US in regime change operations against Syria and also alongside Israel, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda. Don't forget that. And they carried out these raids, which ultimately did what? Took an embattled Israeli government and allowed them to create a unity government, all of their political differences put aside, all of these political and legal crises the Israeli government faced, put on hold so that they can focus on Hamas, which means flattening Gaza and burying Palestinian civilians alive. That's what that actually means. So this is what Hamas has achieved. It also means that the two-state solution is further, not closer. The recent Hamas raids are very similar to the 2011 Arab Spring. Initially, a lot of people, the same people in many instances, were swept away by the 2011 Arab Spring. They honestly believed the Arab world was rising up against all of these US-Israeli proxies. I remember the news articles at the time linking Israel to all of these governments, claiming Hosni Mubarak in Egypt was bringing in plane loads of Israeli weapons to suppress the uprising. And of course, all of this was engineered years in advance, just as Seymour Hersh warned in terms of the the militant networks, and just as the New York Times admitted in terms of the political activists that created the cover of protests to invite in the armed violence. All these people were swayed by their emotions. They refused to analyze it. They refused to look at the flow of money and the associations involved. They failed to zoom out and look at the big picture, and they fell into this trap. It was not a step toward victory. It was a step over a cliff. And that is what the Arab Spring brought. It brought death and destruction across an entire region that is still reeling from the results of all of the wars that expanded out of that, and was not the U.S. co-opting a legitimate movement. The U.S. engineered it years in advance. And now we see Hamas playing the same role. They have been playing the same role all along, and that is what they're still doing to this day. So I am urging people to separate their emotions and what they wish was happening, separate that from your ability to reason and use logic and analyze what is actually happening. Now, one last point I want to hit on before I wrap this video up is looking at the entire Middle East and how the region is changing. We watched Russia and China transform the region. We have watched Russia intervene in Syria in 2015. From 2015 onwards, Russia's presence in Syria, Iran's role in stabilizing, Hezbollah's role in stabilizing the U.S. proxy war in Syria has led to changes across the region. We see nations like Saudi Arabia more hesitant to work with the United States. They are looking for alternatives. Russia and China are creating those alternatives. They're stabilizing the region, and they're creating alternatives, making it possible for a nation like Saudi Arabia to pivot away from supporting and investing in U.S. hegemony in the region to multipolarism. Repairing their ties with Iran was a huge step in that direction. The normalization of Syria with the rest of the Arab world, that is another huge step in that direction. And I just want to point out what Russia is saying about all of this. This is from Politico. Putin blames U.S. for Israel-Hamas conflict. They're not blaming Islamic extremism. They're not blaming Zionism. They're blaming the United States. Russian President Vladimir Putin pointed a finger at the United States for escalating conflict between Israel and Hamas in his first public statement since the Hamas attacks in Israel and Israel's airstrikes in Gaza. I think that many people will agree with me that this is a vivid example of the failure of United States' policy in the Middle East. The problem with the U.S. policy is not taking the core interests of the Palestinian people into account and working to create an independent Palestinian state, because Russia supports the two-state solution. Where does China stand on all of this? Here's an article. U.S.'s biased stance risks undermining efforts to diffuse Israel-Gaza tension. China's foreign ministry spokesperson reiterated China's stance on the current conflict, saying that to end the cycle of conflict between Palestine and Israel, it is essential to restart the peace talks, implement the two-state solution, and seek comprehensive and proper settlement of the Palestinian question through political means at an early date so that the parties' legitimate concerns can be taken care of. So both Russia and China are talking about a two-state solution. They're not talking about violence. They don't support Hamas, at least not their raids. And they don't support Israel bombing Gaza. I think that's very clear to see. The only solution is implementing a two-state solution. It requires creating the conditions in the region to achieve this. And we see Russia and China doing that. It's a slow process. It takes a lot of hard work. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. And every time you see a shortcut dangled over the head of people, you should be very suspicious of that. Whether it's the 2011 Arab Spring protests or these raids Hamas carried out, these aren't shortcuts to peace and stability in the region. They are attempts to disrupt hard work aiming to achieve peace and stability in the region. You have to remember that even in Israel, eventually it will become obvious that U.S. hegemony is fading, its influence in the region is fading. They're not going to be able to support the circles of power in Israel that seek to eliminate the Palestinian people and wage war constantly against their neighbors. Someone will come along and seek actual self-preservation and to actually serve the best interests of the people, the population living in Israel. And so the U.S. has to prevent all of this from happening. The best way to do that is through violence and chaos. That is how they kept Saudi Arabia on side for so long. They involved Saudi Arabia in all of these proxy wars. They became personally invested in it. And they created a situation in the Middle East where they created substantial enemies that they required protection from the U.S. against. And this is what Russia and China have been in the region trying to diffuse. And in Israel specifically, this raid by Hamas, what has it done? I mentioned a unity government. This is an article from Al Jazeera. What is the Israeli unity government and what does it want to achieve? Israel's parliament has approved Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's emergency unity government, including a number of centrist opposition lawmakers, to display its determination to fight the war with Hamas in Gaza. A national unity government, according to Israel, is a government based on a broad coalition, the members of which also include representatives of rival parliamentary groups. This is usually formed at times of national emergencies such as war, natural disasters, economic crises. Before Hamas's surprise attack on Saturday, Israeli politics had faced turbulence over a push by Netanyahu's government to overhaul the country's judiciary that sparked the largest protest movement in Israel's history. Imagine that, the largest protest movement in Israel's history. Ongoing. Hamas's raids, a gift to the Israeli government. They not only end the protests, they force everyone in the Israeli government to unify against Hamas and ultimately against the Palestinian people. The region is shifting. The U.S. seeks to stop it from doing so. Just like Europe was slipping out from under American primacy, Germany building Nord Stream 2 with Russia, the European Union looking at building closer ties with China, participating, certain European Union member states looking to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative. How did the United States disrupt all of that? Provoking war with Russia and Ukraine. That's how they did it. And now they're doing the same thing in the Middle East, using Hamas, who they have used before, part of a larger network that they have used before and are still using in the Middle East. They are creating chaos in the region to scare everyone else back in line. That is what they're trying to do. And we see the United States busy here in Asia attempting to provoke conflicts with China in order to pressure, their supposed allies, especially South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, to make decisions that run contra to their own best interests. In each case, China is their largest trade partner, and the U.S. is provoking these conflicts to force them in a position where they depend solely on the United States. Taiwan as well, despite being an island province of China. I will continue keeping an eye on the conflict in Ukraine, as well as this growing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, which could escalate far beyond that if people are not careful. And I will continue keeping an eye on the situation here in Asia, where almost certainly the U.S. will begin provoking a third crisis, almost certainly. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. In the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. If an ad pops up, feel free to skip it. If you do want to support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation or month-to-month donations, or even if you're just helping share my work with others, I greatly appreciate that. That is what allows me to continue doing this work. So Thank you, and as always, thank you for watching.